Introduction. I don't know how much justice I can do to that. And thank you all, actually, thank you from Dhwani for organizing this series of programs where you are screening this. And I think it's important that we speak about the Constitution now, what it means, the constitutional values. And we are at a juncture in our country today where these very values are under attack. And this is something that we have all been seeing for the last few years. That now, more than ever, the values of the Constitution are something that are not being respected, are not being are directly under attack in many ways. So, in fact, to take from actually how this episode ended and what Dr. Ambedkar says at the end on how ultimately it is not that the courts are going to be the ones who protect. It's not necessarily the law which would ensure the protection of fundamental rights, but it is really the social morality in that sense. And society itself, unless that there is a change in the way we look at things, that's really the rights of everybody is not really going to be looked at. So taking from that, I'll just begin with what Dr. Ambedkar says when he introduces the Constitution, and I think this is something this is a speech that all of us know very well. When he says that now we are entering a period of contradiction. In politics, each person will be equal; they will have equal value. That each one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. But in social and economic life, there is absolutely there is no equality. And and he says that if you look at our country today, there are two main things that we see are really missing. One is equality, and the other is fraternity. So these are the two main issues that main elements that are missing from Indian society. And when he talks about equality, he really says, you look at social inequality, you look at economic inequality, it is so apparent. So social inequality, whether you look at it in the form of the caste system, which sets up this graded inequality, or you look at even in the question of gender, the kind of social inequality that is there, that's so stark. And in terms of economic inequality, he says that on one level you have very, very rich people, and the other you have extreme poverty, people living in extreme poverty in the country. And I think if we take from that and we look at where we stand today, and how we have, how can we answer that? How have we moved past that contradiction, or have those contradictions really sharpened? I think that's really something that for us to look at. And in fact, he warns in that if we don't, it's not enough for people to be satisfied with political democracy. We have to move beyond political democracy to look at social and economic democracy. And unless we actually look at social and economic democracy, political democracy itself will not really be able to sustain itself. So we have to move past political democracy, and the foundation of it has to be made strong, which is of social and economic democracy. And unless we do that, it's not something that, and it's really going to threaten everything else. So I think if we look at that as a kind of standard that was placed before the people, and where we stand today, and how much, whether we have actually come forward in terms of our constitutional goals, or whether those contradictions have only worsened and things have only gotten bad. And then ultimately, what it is that we can do, because this is not only a question of despair. This is not about only feeling unhappy about how the aspirations of the Constitution have not been met, but also about what it is that one can really do going forward. I think that's that's broadly how I have at least thought of what to place before you. If we really look at today's situation, and I think all of us are. I've met many of you in different places. I think most of us are we are all aware of what the situation is, and we look at the idea of equality. And one thing that we must recognize is that the Constitution is the first document which actually spoke about equality in this country. This is a country that is steeped in inequality, which believed, which takes inequality as a law. It was steeped in the law. So it's the first document that actually talks about equality for everybody, irrespective of caste, irrespective of gender, irrespective of religion. It's the first document that actually speaks about it, and it's actually a very important document for that in a society that is so steeped in inequality, we are actually talking about equality, which is also the reason that it's under attack today. People who speak out against it are people who don't believe in equality. Those are the people who believe in inequality, whether it's social or economic. These are people who don't believe that equality is as a means of being should really be there. And it's the first document that talks about fraternity. And fraternity is the other idea that is so essential, because actually without fraternity, in fact, what Dr. Ambedkar says, fraternity is another name for democracy. Right? If you do, democracy is not a form of government. Democracy is how society interacts with each other, how people interact with each other. And if there is no fraternity, you can't speak about democracy. So that's the other thing about the constitution that we have to really keep in mind, in terms of how radical it was at the time it came in. That you actually spoke about something like equality, which is alien to how people were thinking about things over here. So we look at that and we look at where we stand today, and inequality or the lack of fraternity are not incidental things. They happen because there are structures that push for inequality to continue. It's not that incidentally people are unequal. There's so much disparity. There's so much disparity, whether it's socially or economically. So there's structures that have actually pushed for something like this that have pushed for this, and we have to see where we stand today when we're looking at those structures. So just to look at some of these things in terms of if you look at the fundamental rights, and some of it was spoken about in that episode as well. Like for example, you look at something like freedom of speech and expression, and of course they were speaking about press freedoms and how sedition has crept its way in, even after the Supreme Court has said that it's something that one should rethink. It has crept itself in the new laws that replace the penal code. But I'm saying, if we even look beyond it and we look at how something like, say, freedom of speech actually affects how it has played itself out, right? And we see that as an idea, generally in society, it's simply absent. If we look at if you look at the way in which it has really come up. Like, for example, just see in August this year, a Dalit man in Rajasthan was killed for having a moustache. We look at it as an atrocity. It is an atrocity. It's a heinous atrocity. It's very shameful. But ultimately, it's a violation of every fundamental right that the Constitution guaranteed to him. Right from the right to life, to your freedom of speech and expression, to every single thing that is for. So this happened now, and this is not even uncommon. People are killed for Dalits are killed, Dalits are assaulted for simple things like wearing good clothes, wearing sunglasses, and sporting a moustache, and the most basic of things. And while we look at it as a caste atrocity, which it really is, we have to see how does it play itself out when we look at how do we understand it when we think of it as a blatant violation of the constitutional and the fundamental rights that people have, and the constitutional aspirations of equality. If we look at some of the worst atrocities that have taken place ever since independence, and we'll see that so much of it is because people have actually come forward to express themselves. People have come forward to take what has been given by to take what has been assured by the Constitution. Let's look at the Kilvanmini massacre, which took place, where people were burned because they demanded wages. We look at what happened in Bihar, in Batni Tola, where the landless laborers, including women, including children, were killed for demanding increased wages. You look at what has happened, continues to happen. It's where there's any form of expression, where there's any form of almost pursuit of what is guaranteed by the Constitution, you have such a strong assault. So then, where do we look at how do we understand where the constitutional rights have, these fundamental rights, how do we understand how they have really come, reached people? And these are things that happen and continue to happen at such a pace. I mean, you guys work on gender rights, and you do much more than also on domestic violence. And one of the main reasons for domestic violence, if you look at when people are justifying it, is when women speak out. What is that? Speak back. When women speak back is when they are subject to domestic violence, and how do we have to see we have to see that act within the Rajya constitutional framework of understanding how your your freedom of speech and expression, it simply does not exist. How do we understand that? Not to mention right to life with dignity, not to mention anything. How do we see these social interactions that take place on an everyday basis within the constitutional framework of fundamental rights? The one of the rights that are very essential is the right against exploitation, which is under Article 23, which talks about the right against forced labor and against vigor. And the courts have said that even if minimum wages are not paid, it amounts to forced labor. And if you look at our country today, at one level there is such high levels of bonded labor that exists, where people simply are working on somebody else's land or working somewhere for somebody else simply because they took some small loan. And it's something that is so prevalent. Everybody knows it. If you look at plantations, for example, it's something that's so prevalent. That's one level. The other level is where you have, if the courts have said and have interpreted it to say that the non-payment of minimum wages amounts to forced labor. You look at like for example, D group contractualized work, outsourced work anywhere in the state, whether it's within the government or whether it's private, you will see that mostly 90% minimum wages are not paid. For example, sanitation workers, you will see that minimum wages are simply not paid. So how do we see how this has, where do we stand as a country if we have large amount of bonded labor, literally bonded labor, and then you have large amount of people who are working under conditions of forced labor. And if that's the situation that we are speaking about in the country today, then where have we come in the last since the constitution, and how have we really come forward? And for that we have to recognize that the structures that actually hold this and that have kept in place this unequal system, have kept in place inequalities, continue to not only survive but are really being perpetuated. So whether it is caste, whether it's patriarchy, whether it is discrimination on the basis of class, this is something that are really being pushed forward as a conscious way of actually taking as a consciously being perpetuated. So you look at, for example, if you look at how some of these things come together. For example, you look at sanitation workers, and I think Porokarmikas is a struggle that has come for many years, and after which there is a lot of the victory that has emerged from that struggle. If you look at sanitation workers across, whether we look at it in hospitals or whether you look at it within the government sector, whether you look in private sector, there are 2-3 things that we will see. One, that almost all workers they all belong to the Dalit community, because this is work that is associated, this is caste ordained. This is a fact. Nobody does it other than Dalits. Large number of women in this. And the third thing is, they are all under the so-called contract system, where you are outsourced and you're not, and every law that there is being violated. For example, you're not paid minimum wages. They work much more than 8 hours. Their conditions of work are so undignified. And if you go to the airport, the Bangalore International Airport, which is supposed to be such a top class airport, the women who work in the toilets, they have to be in the toilet the entire period. I mean, just imagine standing in the toilet the whole period of your work. You're supposed to be there. Every time somebody goes to the toilet, they go immediately after them, clean it and come out. Every time somebody goes in, you go in, clean it and come out. How do we even understand that kind of work? And you look at it historically, cleaning, the so-called unclean, not so-called, it is only unclean. This work, which is dehumanizing and degrading. It is something that it's an occupation that is caste ordained. And what was previously manual scavenging, now you just see it take on new forms. We have seen photographs of people, in the dry toilets, cleaning it and then taking it on their head. But today you look at it, it's really not very different. You look at if a person has to be in the toilet the whole time, 8 hours minimum, that is their working hours. You're in the toilet the whole time. Every time somebody comes out, immediately you're going out. We all know how much we'll avoid a toilet after somebody comes out of it. But immediately you go in, you clean it and come in. And the new forms in which it has actually taken. And you can't miss the fact that it is linked to caste. That's one. The second thing is that this entire work is outsourced. This entire work, like the union government has abolished D-group work. D-group does not exist in the union government. The work obviously exists because without it nobody can do anything else. But that post does not exist. So they say, oh, we don't have that post, so we can't appoint anybody. So it has to be outsourced, it has to be contractualized. And the nature of contract work is that it is extremely precarious. There is no wage security. So there is no minimum wages are also not paid. Forget fair wages, forget living wages. Minimum wages are not paid. If you ask for your wages to be paid, then you will be thrown out of work. If you ask for any rights, you will be thrown out. Which means that if you are a woman, if you are sexually harassed, that also if you complain about your sexual harassment also, you will be dismissed. You will be thrown out. So there is no wage security, you have no social security. And given how expensive things like hospitals are, at any given point of time, a person, if there is any illness in the family, they are one step away from kind of complete bankruptcy and completely being swallowed into a loan cycle. And you have no social security. And you, at any point of time, you can be thrown out. So these are the conditions under which people are working. So if you see, what is the final outcome of it is that you're simply unable to ensure education for children. You're simply unable to ensure that you come out of this system, which keep pushing you back into this what so-called unskilled work, which means that there's no escaping the system, which means that the poverty continues intergenerationally. Ultimately, given a choice, nobody will do this work, right? But you make sure that same community continues to do this work, and because they are paid so less, there is no coming out of it, and because there is no coming out of it, then it becomes an intergenerational issue, and then this constitutional guarantee of a right to live with dignity, equal opportunity, it all becomes so cut away from what reality is. And if this system is being pushed, if you're saying that this is the economic system that we are going to follow, these are the economic policies that we are going to follow, where certain groups of people will work only under insecure conditions of work, then you're only taking it further and further away from any possibility of meeting these constitutional aspirations. So I think if we look at it from these lights, the real thing is that how these structures have actually really been strengthened by economic and social policies of the state, which have worsened the situation. So we have to recognize that poverty is not incidental. A person is not poor because by chance. A person is poor because that system has pushed that person into poverty and keeps that person into poverty and ensures that that person and their future generations don't come out of poverty. So poverty is not incidental. Malnutrition among children, among women is not incidental. Anemia is not incidental. Why is it that only one community, there is so much anemia, there is so much malnutrition? All of this has to link up, and if you don't see that your conditions of work are so bad, you are working under such horrifying conditions, where you're not even sure if I work this month, whether I'll get paid wages or not. Forget anything else. Even something so basic is not ensured. And you're caught in such a complete debt trap. How is it that, how does one talk about constitutional rights in this reality? And that's the reality of our country today. If you look at the way in which inequality has only grown, if you have 10% of the richest people controlling 70-75% of the wealth, and you have 50% at the lowest having less than 3% of the wealth, then How are we to understand it? And we must recognize that when talking about 10% having 70% of the wealth, it's not that they worked hard to get this wealth. That wealth is got by the 50-60% at the bottom. They make the wealth, and that wealth is taken by the top 5 or 10%. So these structures that have maintained it, whether it's how caste has been embedded and continues to be embedded, how patriarchy continues to be embedded, and how this neoliberal way of thinking has actually has perpetuated both caste and patriarchy. Actually, it's if that's where we stand today, how do we really see how do we see that fundamental rights are really brought into everybody? In fact, Dr. Ambedkar speaks about one thing which is really very, very relevant today, because many people are speaking about easy business. There's make things there's too much ease of doing business. Ease of doing business. Yes. Everybody's talking about ease of doing business, and he speaks about this where he says that when you're talking about rights and keeping some kind of limitations, he says, see, the people say that you just give everybody fundamental rights and everybody will be fine. But to make sure there's no state regulation, everything will be fine. But if we actually do that, what he says is that the argument is that if everybody has fundamental rights and there's no state regulation, the residue is freedom. But the question is, who is that freedom for? That freedom is for the landowner to charge as much as he wants to the tenant. That freedom is for the employer to decide any conditions of work. If you don't have state regulation, if you don't have a regulatory mechanism safeguarding the most marginalized and people who are in the lower end of the bargaining spectrum, then what you actually have is a dictatorship of the private employer. That the private employer becomes a dictator insofar as the people who are working are concerned, and he will decide what is to be done and what's not to be done. And if we see what is happening today, it's so apparent that all his warnings really are coming true. The fact that we don't have social and economic democracy today, and there's such high levels of social and economic inequality, are so apparent. Of course, not to forget that political equality, political democracy itself is under challenge. We are in a situation where the exercise of the election commission in the name of this special intensive revision has resulted is the biggest disenfranchisement exercise that we have seen in our country. You have lakhs of people being disenfranchised today. So you have you have the political equality itself under threat, not to mention social and economic equality. The other aspect, like what Dr. Ambedkar spoke about, he spoke about equality and he spoke about fraternity. And fraternity is the other very core idea of a democracy that is really under threat today. Whether it's and this is something that we have all seen, the levels to which fraternity is being affected, so much so that there are parts of the country where people belonging to different religions simply will not speak to each other. There is such high levels of segregation, and there is such high levels of we are almost where we're talking about a situation where there is a kind of social apartheid against certain communities. We have seen during COVID the way in which Muslim street vendors were not allowed to go. They were not allowed to come into certain places. All kinds of statements are made. In fact, I brought a report which we had done recently in Mangalore, where a person who was doing waste picking, his name is Mr. Ashraf, he was lynched by a group of people. And so unfortunately, there was really no outcry against it. And that's something that is so disturbing, that there is a person who's lynched. But we're not, it has become part of our way of being. That is okay. We don't feel that there is something so fundamentally wrong with it. So what has happened to the dream of fraternity? And the way in which, what was thought of as what would happen in terms of the society really coming together, people really breaking down these barriers. And the same remains if you look at how whether we can talk about fraternity when we talk about caste, and it's simply not. I mean, look at your matrimonial ads. Everything is on the basis of caste. You're simply refusing to move beyond that. Every matrimonial website, your newspapers, all of them talk about it. So people who speak about the non-existence of caste or whatever today, how does one move forward if there's absolutely no breaking down of these barriers? And So then, if fraternity is in such a there's such a strong attack on fraternity, really, how do we counter that? Is something that we have to think. And of course, the third part of the trident is liberty, and that's also something that what I already spoke about in terms of if we are talking about liberty, we have to recognize it how these social structures simply don't allow for liberty to take place. Recently, somebody I think they shared a video. The person walking through some part of the village. They take out their slippers. They have to take out their slippers and walk for one part of it. So where is the question of liberty when we are talking about it? And we have seen the way in which liberty has been physically taken away. For anybody who speaks out against the state, who speaks out against, who speaks for people, whether it's we all know about what has happened in Delhi with Umar Khalid and others who have been who are in jail without a trial, without bail for over 4-5 years now. And similarly, if you look at what has happened in Bhima Koregaon, some of them are out, but still people from Kabir Khala Manch, they still remain in. And for what? For speaking out against hate, for speaking for constitutional values. So where do we stand in terms of liberty if we really look at it now? So I think ultimately, if you have to really look at a way forward, and we look at if there have been any fundamental changes that have actually been brought out, it has only been really brought out by people coming together. And this is something that we saw during the anti-CEA movement, where so many people came out together, which forced the government to really stop itself in its divisive methods. And then similarly, we look at where have there been real victories, is again where people have come together. So for example, like the farmers' protests, where they had to roll back the anti-farmer laws. Ultimately, it's the power of coming together, the people uniting and organizing and fighting against it that has actually really brought about this kind of a change. And even if you look at, for example, I spoke about the sanitation workers, I spoke about Purakarmikas, and the struggle of Purakarmikas in Karnataka itself is a huge, it's huge inspiration really. I don't know if you all know much about, have read about it, but Purakarmikas who clean the streets, who clean the roads, they were initially under a contract system, and it was so foul. The whole system was so corrupt, it was so exploitative, people were getting paid 2,000, 3,000. And then they came together, unionized, fought against it. They removed the contract system, perhaps the only time in the country that such a large number of people have been able to push the contract system out. And now they have, in fact May this year, they have been regularized and they have been made permanent. So that's 12,500 in Bangalore, and if you look at the entire state, it's about 20,000 or so, 50, maybe 18 to 20,000 workers. And it's a huge victory, and it's something that did not happen from court, and I really don't know whether it will ever happen from court, something like this. But it only came to happen because people came together. And if you look at who managed to get it done, it's people who suffer from the triple oppression of caste, class, gender. And their struggle of coming together and actually being able to get this is not only about regularization, it's not only about increased wages, but it's really like almost like it is an anti-caste struggle that has come out of this, right? It's a struggle against patriarchy where they have managed to break through against people who have been harassing them in all kinds of ways. And so this struggle is much more than just a struggle for wages or a struggle for permanency. So it has to be seen as a struggle that actually breaks which attacks these structures of inequality. And ultimately, the only real way in which people can get their fundamental rights and push towards their constitutional ideals is actually by coming together, fighting against these structures, and being able to come one step towards it. Of course, there are a lot of problems. There's still many things that have to be done. It's not that, but it's a step towards that. And ultimately, we have to really look at how is it that we ensure fundamental rights for everybody. It ultimately the power lies with the people. Power lies with people to really come together and say that, we will ensure that what is guaranteed, what is assured to by the Constitution will be given to everybody. So I think uh, I think like all of you would be towards that only. But I think that it's like it's something that is really requires us to come together to do that. And I think that's why it's also so important that you all are doing this series, where you all are screening this, talking, having these discussions and talks about what and how we can actually ensure that this reaches more. The ideas, are brought more into reality, and there's this contradictions. How do we attack those contradictions to ensure that more people are actually assured these rights?